and I'm just trying to see whether I can somehow at least see you. Maybe that will work. Or a minimized view. There. Okay, I hope this will come up now as I share the screen. No, but I have to. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my bearings here. You have not made me a co-host yet, so therefore I cannot share my screen yet. Detlef?
Recording in progress.
And you will have to move there. Detlef, are you still there?
Yes, I made you co-host now.
Sorry, I'm just struggling to see where I can share my screen. Sorry, I'm a little bit. Sorry, this is really odd. Share. Here we go. Now I have it.
While you are still setting up, who is 1VTFOT?
Das bin ich, Herr, aber ich weiß nicht, wieso
Okay,
das so drauf.
I'll rename you Hertha, that's fine.
Yeah, just with one H, one in front.
Okay, that like that. Then
Thank
we'll
you.
know if you want to talk who it is. Okay.
All right. So you should be seeing my shared screen now, I believe.
Yes, we do.
All right. Okay. So I don't know. Is there anybody here that participated in Impangeni on this same topic? Anyone? There's one very significant shift of emphasis that I'm going to put, and it is already contained here in my title for the day. Preparing a devotion, one good thought is enough. And before I go into the slides, I want to really emphasize, almost go to town with this thought. There is a tendency among those that are just starting out with doing devotions to want to try to put too much content into a devotion. And that's why I really want to drive home this point. One good thought is enough. Everything else needs to be shaped around that one good thought. And as we go into the details now, you'll see what I mean. And I'll keep coming back to that thought. But yeah, again, as with PJ's presentation, anyone who has a question or a comment at any point in time, please raise your hand or just simply unmute yourself. I think there's not so many of us on this. I see there's 20 participants, so I think it's quite okay for people to just unmute themselves and ask when I take half a breath between sentences. So all right, preparing a devotion, one good thought is enough. Starting off, my first thought is devoted to this question: what is a devotion and what is it not? The German ones amongst us might be familiar, or will certainly be familiar with the term Andacht. And that already brings us a little bit into what it is. Devotion is just a moment of slowing down and thinking of something. Andacht, andächtig sein. Devotion, devoting some time to thinking about our faith. Now, devotion is not a Bible study, and that is, I think, an error that a lot of people that are starting out make, is they want to throw every detail that they can find in a text into a devotion. That's not the point of a devotion. A devotion is much more focused. A Bible study is basically going down every rabbit trail. that the text presents, or that we can somehow see that the text might lead us into. That's a Bible study. A devotion is much more focused. It's around one main thought. A devotion is also not a sermon. A sermon is also more focused than a Bible study, but allows some room because of its length and because of the way that we can structure a sermon. It allows more space to develop and to dig into little rabbit trails or specific details of a text. A devotion is not a sermon. A devotion is also not just a retelling of a Bible story. Over the years, I've experienced some devotions that have been done, and I probably in my early years made that mistake myself a few times, where just the retelling of the story, which then doesn't really connect to the hearer in any significant way. And one can tell some beautiful Bible stories, but again, a devotion is not that. Then maybe on the other side of the falling off on the other side of the horse, a devotion is not just simply a pop psychology pep talk. A devotion in the Christian sense needs to connect to something significant about of the Christian faith. It cannot simply just pick up on some popular theme of pop psychology. So to say what a devotion is then, in fact, if I've already said 4 things that it is not, a devotion is a short talk on a matter of Christian faith for a specific audience in a specific place. It may or may not include a particular Bible verse, but it certainly seeks to illuminate an aspect of Christian faith or of Christian life. Ideally, it has here, I'm driving this point home very clearly. Ideally, it has one main point expressed in a simple, clear way, and then with examples and maybe a story linked into that to illuminate it. But that one point is, if I can get one point across today, it is that a devotion has one point. I'm harping on that a little bit, maybe too much, but I probably didn't do that enough the previous time I did this presentation. Any questions or thoughts on that up to now? Anything? Otherwise, I'll happily move along.
Yeah, you say it's a short talk. How many minutes, roughly?
That will depend a little bit on what I'm sort of jumping to the end point a bit by this. Of course, the devotion needs to connect at the end of the day. It needs to somehow connect to my audience. And of course, to some degree, the setting will determine the length of it. So it can be as short as 1 minute. It can be as long as maybe 6 or 7 minutes. I think when you're getting towards 10, 12 minutes, you are pretty much in the realm of a sermon already. So there's no very clear distinction or dividing line between a devotion and a sermon. But in terms of time, I would say the closer you get to 10 minutes, and of course, anything beyond 10 minutes is certainly a sermon and not a devotion anymore. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Then there's a raised hand, Khale Balwe.
Yes, thanks for taking my question or my hand. Yeah, that means I've been using it wrongly. Because when I read how you try to describe it, I'm still not getting it right. So is it a one way where you don't give the audience a chance to chip in terms of how they understand it, or under which circumstances would you use it, the devotion?
I would say a devotion normally is pretty much one person presenting a thought. There may be discussion afterwards, but the devotion itself, I would say, is one person sharing a significant thought with an audience. Again, if there's a lot of discussion around it, I would tend towards calling it a Bible study or a topical workshop or something like that. Also, just from a length point of view, I mean, if it is as short as 2 or 3 minutes, if there's a lot of people talking, then there's probably not that much opportunity for the main presenter to present their main thought. So by that fact, it would already probably become longer, which then moves it into the territory of something else other than a devotion. That's according to my definition. I know there might be other definitions out there, but yes.
I think Detlef's
Thanks.
devotion at the beginning was a good example.
Yes, yeah. I don't know whether everybody heard that. Gisela sitting next to me here said, what Detlef did at the beginning of the first session is a typical example of a short devotion. Yeah. All right. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I'm clear. I'm answered. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's move on then, or unless there's another question at this point. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I must ask, can we say it's a sermonette or what? I don't know.
Yeah, okay. We can get very much bogged down in different terms. A sermonette already for me would be a little bit more than just a devotion. So a sermonette might be an 8-minute or 10-minute sermon, and anything beyond 10 minutes is a full-on sermon. I know that in some traditions, anything shorter than 30 minutes cannot be a sermon. But this is now my definition. We can argue definitions, but I think let's rather get into the content, if that's all right with you. Yeah, is that all right? Let's move on. Some general principles that I would say up front before we get into the technical details of how to go about it is this. Firstly, know why you are giving the devotion. Sometimes the setting already defines that quite clearly. If you've got whatever, say a bunch of school children on a Monday morning sitting in front of you in the hall of the church, and the headmaster has asked you to do a 5-minute devotion, you know why you are giving this devotion. You want to share a thought with those school children sitting there in the hall. But sometimes it's a little bit more unclear. So you need to be clear in your mind, from the setting, from the circumstances, why you are giving this devotion. Yeah, I mean, depending on the situation, that can be very different reasons. But yeah, what? Yeah, typical examples would be that sometimes a member of the church may ask you as a fellow church member, or maybe in your capacity as a lay preacher, or maybe in your capacity as a women's group leader, or whatever it might be, to give a birthday devotion on a certain day. Typically, when we have special congregational events, maybe we may be asked to do a short devotion. And then, of course, knowing why we're doing it helps us to clarify what we then do in this devotion. Again, the main point needs to, you need to decide on a main point that you want to bring across. You can choose a verse or a Bible passage that relates to this main point. But again, it is also quite possible to do a thematic devotion where there's not a particular Bible verse, but a theme that would somehow connect, or that has to be a theme that is obviously related to the Christian faith. So yeah, not absolutely essential to have a Bible verse or a Bible passage, but it does help to focus our thoughts. Then this is a big one, and we'll unpack that one a lot more in detail as the talk goes on. Try to understand the context of the passage or the verse if you are going to use a Bible passage or a verse. It just helps that we don't force the verse or the Bible passage to say something that it actually isn't saying. I'll unpack that a lot more. And then it's important to relate that lesson that we see in that text, or the lesson that we're trying to bring across from a thematic point of view, to relate that lesson to our own life before we try to apply it to the lives of the listeners. If it doesn't speak to us, then we need to ask ourselves, why are we choosing that message or that passage? And in that case, maybe also reconsider, if it doesn't speak to us, how are we going to help to make that text speak to our listeners? Some more general principles. Keep in mind who our hearers are. That could be in many different ways. We might want to consider the age of our hearers. Is it younger people? Is it older people? Is it people with a very high level of education? Is it people with a limited level of education? Is it a mix of all of the above? Is it people that are already Christians and have been Christians for a long time? Or is it possible that there might be a significant number of people that are sitting in the audience that may, for whatever reason, be sitting there with and willing to listen, but not necessarily having coming from a place of a Christian faith commitment already. All these sort of factors. Of course, maybe something else to consider are the people that are sitting there all mother tongue speakers of the language I'm going to be delivering the devotion in, or might there be second language speakers, even third language speakers amongst them? How, what can I take for granted as far as their ability to understand what I'm saying as well? And then obviously adjusting my language accordingly. That's another factor. Here's another thing. Your story or devotion doesn't have to be extraordinary. Sometimes people try to just overload a devotion to the point where where it just really tries too hard to be something that it isn't. A simple thought can also be a very meaningful devotion. It doesn't have to go completely over the top. Of course, be prepared, unless literally, I mean, sometimes you may be called on to do a devotion on the spur of the moment. But in general, if you have the time, be prepared. But again, also here, one little bit of a caveat here. Keep the preparation appropriate to the occasion. I mean, there's absolutely no point in doing 20 hours of exegesis on a Bible passage to give a 2-minute devotion at the beginning of a talk, where the talk is actually the main point and not the devotion. But still, be prepared in appropriate measure to what you're trying to achieve. Especially if you feel a bit overwhelmed, don't be afraid to ask for help or look for help as you're busy preparing. There's, of course, a lot of resources, a lot of books and online resources available. But also, if you're struggling with a certain thought or not sure whether you can say something in a certain way, speak to other believers in your church, speak to the pastor if you are concerned that what you're saying is controversial or maybe won't go down well. Just make use of whatever's available to determine whether what you want to say is appropriate or helpful. Then another one, as strange as it may seem, a lot of people, particularly when they are inexperienced or nervous, tend to be overly apologetic for what they want to say. When you are asked to do a devotion in whatever setting, you have a right to be there and to be that person delivering that devotion. So don't apologize or don't appear apologetic. Say what you got to say, and that's it. Then don't be afraid, and this might sound a bit like a contradiction to point 7, but don't be afraid to use striking verbal images, visual pictures, or even physical objects. it's not all about theatrical performance, but it doesn't, or it can enhance a devotion if you do something that will be a little bit more memorable. And that can be something as simple as having a physical object in your hand that you're using to illustrate something. The technical term for that would be an object lesson, where you can do a devotion in the form of an object lesson. But of course, a devotion can also be around a piece of art, whether it be a sculpture or a drawing, a painting, that you can either give the audience as a little printout, if you have the opportunity to print out, say, a picture, or else put it up on the data projector. Many of the venues that we use these days, of course, have these technical audiovisual support equipment to do that. But of course, again, appropriate to the setting that you are that you are working in, or where the devotion will be delivered, and try to make the most of the best use of that venue as well. A devotion might look quite different if you're doing it around a campfire, or whether you're doing it in the formal setting of a church, whether you're doing it in someone's living room. All these different places might affect the words you choose, maybe even the tone and the sort of atmosphere, how formal or how informal you present it. Yeah. These are some general principles, and I'm give another opportunity here for questions or comments, and before we delve into the more technical how we go about it. Any questions, any thoughts?
Martin, you're talking to Musadi here. I
Yes.
just want to ask a question. You know, sometimes you are asked to open up with a prayer during a wedding ceremony.
Yes.
And then starting with a prayer, sometimes it's tricky. You find yourself picking up a verse, and with short words, you give a devotion. Is that correct? I won't say it's a sermon because you just picked up that that reading and just say something that is related to the wedding.
Yeah. Okay, so here a couple of things. Again, it would depend very much on the setting. If that is in that setting, and particularly in my experience in various more African settings, at a wedding or at a funeral or at those sort of settings where you're asked to say a prayer, it's almost expected that you give either at least a short verse or maybe even a verse with a bit of a devotion around it. If the setting calls for it, by all means, go ahead. In other settings, maybe just a simple verse without much additional content of in the form of a devotion might also be appropriate. If the setting calls for it, by all means, but be aware again of that setting. Don't try to force it in a setting where it might not be called for. But that would also be another form of a devotion where you say maybe just a Bible verse, 3 sentences or 5 sentences on that Bible verse, and then go into a prayer. That is also a legitimate form of a devotion. As I say, a devotion can be literally as short as 1 minute, 5 sentences, but depending on the setting. I don't see a problem with that at all.
May I come in then? Sorry, I'd just like to refer to your point 9. Asking for help or look for help. You know, something has really helped me. If I'm given a text to deliver a sermon and I really don't know where to start, some people choose a different text. That's not for a sermon. Also applies for devotion. But prayer is the beginning. I feel if I don't know what to say, I pray first of all for the audience that I size it up correctly. And what is my devotion going to be? It works. I'm sure you can add that. Yeah, almost added to point 9 instead of asking a colleague or whoever the Lord is there to help you. Thank you.
Certainly, yeah. And that is another point that one can certainly bring in here. In general, be aware of the very real possibility that as we do a devotion, that the Holy Spirit works through us. And of course, in our preparation, we can be deliberate about in prayer to say, Holy Spirit, help me find the right words to say the right thing in the setting, that word that I'm sharing doesn't come back empty, but truly is a seed that may be sown in the heart of the hearer. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Any more comments or thoughts? Otherwise, I'm going to introduce you now, and this is almost, I was a lot backwards and forwards in my mind how much detail I need to go in here, because in a way, this very same key that I will introduce you to now, which is a key for preparation, and I emphasize for preparation because this doesn't really help you get to your end product. It merely helps you to do the homework that may be required to understand what a particular Bible verse or a particular Bible passage might mean. The same key you could also very easily use if you go into enough detail. You can use it for sermon preparation too. There's obviously a lot of different approaches, a lot of different ways of engaging with a Bible text. This one here, I thought, or I think is equally usable for a devotion as for a full sermon. However, for the devotion, you may need to just limit the time spent on this, again, for that you don't end up going down a million rabbit trails. That said, another thing that I want to say up front before I introduce you to this key is that the difficulty with working with a Bible text or a Bible verse is, as you try to determine the meaning of the text, there's a lot of things that you may discover as you delve into it that will not be relevant to your final message that you're bringing. It's interesting for you to keep in the back of your mind, but if you're going to try to bring every insight that your preparation brings into your devotion, first of all, you are going to end up with a sermon or a Bible study and not a devotion. And secondly, yeah, it will just become way too long. But the difficulty is that we are, until we've done the homework, we do not know what significant point will help us to bring home our main point in this devotion. So therefore, if we are going to be thorough about it, we will have to go through every one of these steps. But we need to be aware that a large part of what we are doing in our preparation will not have any direct bearing on the final product. But only after we've done our preparation can we actually know which parts we will take forward into our final product. And then another thought maybe before I introduce you to these things is that we may, the more knowledge we have about the Bible and the more knowledge we have about our hearer as well, the easier it is going to be that we don't have to spend hours and hours on this. A lot of these things, if those of you who have attended some of the Bible modules will already recognize, oh, but there's this and that will already help us, that we don't have to go and read up now because we still got it in our mind from the training that we've experienced, or that we've been part of. And that will help us. Obviously, if you have very little knowledge of the Bible, you will literally have to research all of these things from scratch. But yeah, we'll get into that now. So the PPT-CCA key, it's not a particularly nice acronym that will flow from your tongue, but it covers some useful and important things that we need to look at when we're looking at a Bible verse or a Bible text. So the words or these letters in the acronym stand for the following: person, and that means every person that is somehow connected to that text. It could be the persons appearing in the text, the characters of a story, if it's a story, the person who wrote it, or the person who said it, if it is a quote, for example, will have a bearing on the meaning of that text. The place may or may not be significant, but again, we don't know until we've actually done the homework. There may be a particular significance in the place where the events take place or where the statement is made, and we need to check on that. The time that it happens, it could be completely insignificant, whether it is at whatever at 3 o'clock in the morning or in the afternoon or in the morning, but it may be very significant to our understanding of a particular verse or a particular text. Of course, time can also mean that it happened in the times of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, or did it happen in the time of the kings, or did it happen in the time of the Babylonian exile, or did it happen during the time of the ministry of Jesus, or the time after Jesus, the time of Acts? And again, there, certain times might be very significant. Did it happen before, to link up to a point of what PJ mentioned earlier? Did it happen before the temple fell, or did it happen after the temple fell? Yeah, all those sort of things can have a significant meaning as we determine the meaning of a text. That sort of, yeah, goes into context. The context in which it is written plays, yeah, I may have loaded a little bit too much into the word, but of course covers all of that. What was happening at the time when that text was written, or the events of that text took place, can also, yeah, we'll unpack that a little bit more in detail. Then the concretion, that's a bit of a technical term. It basically means how did all of these, the other four things, person, place, time, context, how does that basically flow into how that particular text was written? We'll unpack that a little bit more just now. And then finally, the aim of the text. As you can see, all these points at this stage are just about our preparation. This aim does not refer to the aim that I might have in my devotion, but what is the aim of the text or the verse that I'm going to use. So all of this is still very much in the preparation phase, and only after that do we go into how do we actually put together our devotion. All right, so let's unpack this a bit more. Let's move on to person. Who are the persons in the passage? Who is acting? Who is talking? Who is saying something? What do I know about these persons? Were they men, women, children, elderly people? What was their profession? Fisherman, potter, tax collector, whatever. And of course, maybe also something about the culture of that person. The fact that, say, for example, a particular person in a story, we are told that they are a Samaritan. What do I know about Samaritans? Or if we are told this person is a priest, what do we know about priests? Or jumping back to the Old Testament, that he was a prophet in Israel, or maybe in Judah, or maybe during the exile in Babylon. What do we know about prophets? What do we know about their role and what they were doing? Was this person maybe a person in the very early parts of the Old Testament, one of the patriarchs? What role did they play, and at what point? And this is maybe just a little bit of an aside that might also help us. What did this person, in the time that they were happy that these events were happening, what did they already know about God and about God's revelation at that point? For example, if we're looking at the patriarchs who lived in a time when the Ten Commandments were not there yet, it would be wrong and anachronistic for us to demand of them knowledge of the Ten Commandments in their actions. So, for example, some people say, yeah, but I mean, how on earth could Abraham sacrifice his son? Or even that the thought crossed his mind. Of course, he didn't at the end, but how on earth is that possible? Because clearly the Ten Commandments say you shall not murder. But if he didn't have the Ten Commandments yet, how can we make that demand of him that he should have knowledge of that? That's, yeah, one of many questions that we can ask of the different persons that might appear. So what is typical? What are the characteristics of these persons? What clothes might they be wearing? Not only in general, but on that particular occasion. The personality of that person. Is it a reckless person, a talkative person, an aggressive person, an introvert, somebody of high standing, somebody of low standing in society at the time? All these questions can be asked of the persons. And again, much of what we discover might be totally irrelevant for our final devotion, but maybe one particular important point we realize, hang on, this is something that I need to mention, because otherwise, yeah, either because it strengthens the point I'm trying to make, or else because otherwise people might completely misunderstand who this person is. Right, any questions on person? Otherwise, I'll move on. Place. Where does the action take place? Is it in a city, in a village, on the streets, in a house, outside, wherever, on the sea, on a boat or a ship, maybe in the desert, in the mountains, on the mountains? What other events? And this is of course, here we need a lot of Bible knowledge to maybe connect the dots here. What other events have happened or will happen here in the future? A particular mountain, for example, reappears several times in the Old Testament in significant events and suddenly reappears in the New Testament. The Temple Mount, there are certain references to the Old Testament, for example. The River Jordan, what is the significance of the River Jordan? Is there any particular significance if we're talking about John the Baptist who baptized in the River Jordan, and maybe some of the Old Testament stories of how they crossed the Jordan? Is there a significant point to be made there? Again, there may be a significant point or there may not be a significant point, but we only know that until we only know that once we've done our homework. Is there anything significant in the name of the place? Because when we read the Bible, we may come across a certain place name that is just either a name or has a particular significant meaning. An example, the place where Jesus is born, Bethlehem, we call it. Beit Lechem is the Hebrew and probably the Aramaic, I'm not sure, meaning of, or the pronunciation, and that means the house of bread or the place of bread. Is there any significance if we say Jesus is the bread of life, that he was born in the place called the house of bread? May be significant in the devotion that we're doing, may be completely insignificant. Time. What is significant about the time of day that this is taking place? Classic example, Jesus who meets the woman at the well at lunchtime. It's significant that we pick up on that if we're going to do a devotion about this story. We can't ignore that. But then again, other events might have happened at lunchtime and there's no particular special meaning. Is there a specific day of the week, the Sabbath maybe, that is significant? What do we know about the Sabbath? How does an event taking place, for example, the disciples of Jesus who were picking grains on the Sabbath, the whole situation would not have happened if they had not done it on a Sabbath, but on a weekday. So the Sabbath and the laws around the Sabbath are significant in how these events unfold. Yeah, maybe some stories are significant around the question of, was it someone's birthday on that day, or was there a specific Jewish feast that was celebrated? A lot of the Old Testament, and in fact, some of the gospel narratives also, it's quite important to ask that question. What is the significance of a particular feast day where that happened? When, for example, the 12-year-old Jesus, as Mary and Joseph take him to Jerusalem for one of the feasts, and that particular feast happened to be the Passover feast, Pesach. What's the significance of that as we tell that story in a devotion, maybe? In which time is the story set? We've picked up on that already. How does that shape the events and the way that they are being reported? There's different things that might play a role also in how those events are being told in the Bible passage. What happened? Yeah. What has happened already? What is likely to happen? Even when we're reading not a narrative text, but say a text that is in the form of a letter. A large part of the New Testament are letters written by Paul and others. They might be speaking about certain things quite differently, whether the letter is being written before the fall of Jerusalem or after the fall of Jerusalem. How the story is being told, or how the statements that are being made in a letter might be quite different around that. All right, that's time, context. This is now sort of the widest of these words that we need to look at. What is the context? What is happening? What is it all about? What were the politics of the day? In a text that, for example, comes up in the Old Testament in the times of the kings, there's certain ways in which society was operating that will have a bearing on how these events unfold, which might be different in the time of the judges before the kings. The role of the prophets in the time, I mean, some prophets operated just at the beginning of the time when the kings of when the first kings of Israel came about. Some while the kings were ruling, and others while the kingdoms had already fallen and the people were in exile in Babylon. What role did they play there? What role did various powerful nations around Israel in Old Testament texts play? There might be significance in the fact that it happened to be the Babylonians or the Persians that were in power, because the Babylonians and the Persians had very different foreign policy approaches. We need to read up about that if we realize that there is a certain king or a certain foreign nation with a particular foreign policy at the time. Or for example, was Egypt weak or poor at a particular, weak or strong at a particular time, plays a significant role. What opponents were being opponents to each other at a particular time might play a very, very significant role. Who is talking to whom? As you read a text, and this is maybe an often overlooked aspect of determining the context, try to imagine yourself in that situation. How could that event or that situation being described, what would the smells or the tastes or the feelings at the time, what would it have felt like? What would you have seen or heard if you had been an onlooker in that situation? It might help you dig into that context and make it come alive to your hearer when you then go to the next step of preparing the actual devotion that you want to do. What objects may have played an important part? For example, just if there was a stone or a seed mentioned, for example, the parable of the sower, what would those seeds have looked like? What did they feel like? Maybe that can help you to make this come alive. Again, maybe give you an idea already to somehow use it as an object lesson. Maybe when you're talking about the parable of the sower, bring some seeds along as you're telling it, or a stone or something else. When Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount speaks of the lamp that is being placed on top of a lampstand, maybe it might help your hearers, your listeners, to pick up on that. What is it? Not just talk about that lamp being put up on a lampstand, but maybe doing that, drawing the curtains that people may experience for themselves the significance of that lamp on the lampstand, that kind of thing. How can I explain the meaning and show my listeners? Are there words and expressions that I do not understand? Chances are my listeners will also not understand them. Let me go and look up the meaning of these words so that I can use them sensibly and correctly. And of course, a lot of this information you will find in Bible dictionaries, commentaries, handbooks, online resources, that kind of thing. That's context. Again, please feel free to interrupt me at any point to ask questions or share your thoughts. The concretion. This is now the question of not only what is going on in the background, but how does this text illuminate, show what is going on there? Certain things, sorry, I have a fly here in front of me. How is the, certain things might be taken for granted in a text that they simply assume, the writer simply assumes you might know about. When he mentions a certain place name, when Jerusalem is mentioned or the temple is mentioned, the writer might assume that the reader just simply knows what is meant. And maybe when you're looking at that, you might need to read up a bit more about it so that you understand. And of course, some things are not possible to know. When we look at the book of Revelation, for example, we're just busy working through that in our Bible study, our seniors Bible study here at the APN retirement homes. Now, this is now in the setting of a Bible study where we can delve deeper. But if we choose to use a Bible text from a Revelation for a devotion, we may not even be able to dig deep enough to truly understand. We may still be able to pick up something significant that can still make an important, valid point, but we may not be able to fully understand some of the imagery that we find there. So we here in this point, we also need to be quite aware of what form of text, and there's many different forms of texts, and some of them might not be immediately obvious. This is a topic for another much more in-depth study on the different forms, the different genres of texts that we may encounter in the Bible. Is it a historical account? The Exodus, for example, tells the story of what happened. But of course, maybe some of the points of how the story is told may not be absolutely historically provable, or might not even be 100% historically accurate. Even when we look at the Gospels, for example, they come in the form of a historical account, but they do not even claim themselves to be a complete historical account of the life of Jesus. There may be very significant parts of the life of Jesus that are not told in the Gospels, because the purpose of the Gospels is not to give a complete historical account of the life of Jesus, but to tell all those parts of the story that are significant to make the claim that Jesus is the Messiah, essentially. So some parts might be omitted that are not considered important for the purpose of making that claim so that people may believe. Some parts of the Bible are told a told story. In other words, as we read it, it's not just simply a story that took place or that may or may not have taken place, but a story being told in order to make a particular point. The parables of Jesus are a classic example of that. Some of them are discourse. Paul's letters, for example, they try to argue a certain point, or they try to explain something to the readers who may be a particular church in a particular place that need to hear a certain message. That message may apply one-to-one to us. It may also not apply one-to-one to us. If Paul makes certain statements that might be sort of culturally bound or relevant to a particular hearer, a particular church in a particular place, we need to be very careful to then just simply assume that it is universally applicable in all settings and in all places. Some sections of the Bible are what would be called hagiography, where certain people are, only the good things are told of certain people. And some sections of Kings and Chronicles you may find, and some of them might even be the horizontal opposite, where a king is described as the most amazing king in the book of Chronicles, and in the book of Kings, because it's a different writer with a different purpose, might say that this very same king is the worst king ever and did the most heinous crimes. And in Chronicles, only the good things about the king would be told. There's another part of, or another type of genre in Scripture, and that is that of wisdom literature in the Old Testament. We read certain parts, if it is understood as wisdom literature, we will read it quite differently to if we read it as a historical account of certain things. We read, for example, the book of Job. When we read it as wisdom literature, we read it quite differently to if we read it as an actual factual account of what happened, that kind of thing. And then we need to always ask ourselves, how does that influence the way that I read and understand the text? That makes sense so far? Now we get to the aim. What is the main message of the text? Again, we are still busy with preparation here. We're not busy yet with writing our own devotion yet. What is the main message of the text? How does it apply in the original setting? And then how does the message translate into my current situation? Is a significant question that then starts to lead us to the place where we get to actually write our own devotion that we plan to deliver. All right, I think that was all the main points there. Now we sort of on the process of jumping from our homework to the final product, and just some general comments here again. We need to reflect on how this text, now that we have all the background knowledge, may connect to our hearers. What point do we want to bring across? Again, the text itself might bring a whole lot of different points across, but we may not want to pick up on every single one of those. We may want to only pick up on one of those and develop that in more detail. So we need to reflect on that, how this text may connect to our hearers. And then we need to decide which insights from our preparations are particularly relevant to the audience and the point that I want to make on this particular occasion. And then comes possibly the most difficult step, putting everything else aside. We may have come across some deeply profound and some amazing thoughts that we've never understood before, and we say, wow, that's an incredible insight. But will it help me to make my main point to my audience on that day? And we have to put some things aside. One theologian, and I keep forgetting to read up who it was, said that some parts, as we prepare a dinner or a Sunday lunch for that matter, some parts need to go into the bin and some parts need to go on the dinner table. And as we prepare, we might not know exactly which parts need to go into the bin and which parts need to then go onto the dinner table until we've actually figured that out. When we cut up a potato, it might look perfect from the outside, and there might be some really bad parts about it that need to go into the bin. We only know which parts those are. And that doesn't mean necessarily that that all the parts that we throw in the bin, and this is where the picture maybe breaks down a little bit, it doesn't mean that those parts are worthless. It just simply means they will not help me to put together my devotion for that day. So we need to make sure that our main idea is clear in our mind, and that everything that does not support the main point, but rather detracts from it, even if it is something that we find particularly interesting at that point. So we need to make sure that our main idea takes center stage in our preparation. I think that was, now I'm jumping to the next one. All right, now I've said a lot of things, and maybe I will give an opportunity now for some questions before I go to my final point and thought of the day. And I realize I don't quite see, can we have a time check? I don't have, is it 12? Okay, so we have another half an hour. Any questions, any comments, any thought at this point before I move on to my final slide that we'll spend quite a bit of time on?
Yeah, maybe just a comment, Hadi, that you know, I learned that
I'm sorry, my sound went off here. I might not have heard anything that anybody said. Any questions?
Oh, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Sorry, my speaker just switched itself off, so I didn't even get a chance to hear. Now you can speak.
Okay, no, I say on one of the co-workers workshops, you know, I learned that whatever you put aside, you can always use next time, so you don't throw it away to the bin.
Yes, okay. Yeah. The picture might, I might have said it too harshly. Of course, those parts, yeah, you may put them on the shelf as well for later use. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Then let's move on to the last and not most important part, but certainly a very important part in the process. And that is, now that I've got all this background knowledge, how do I go about preparing the final devotion, the actual final product that I will be delivering then in front of my audience? And here I've found, and this might be a massive oversimplification, but I've found a particular approach that is actually commonly used in children's ministry and in youth ministry. I found a very simple and easy way to just frame or shape my devotion. And that is simply 4 simple little words, all of them 4-letter words that look all exactly or almost exactly the same. Simple 4 words: hook, book, look, and took. And please, if there are any English grammar teachers here, please do not crucify me for the fact that the last word is in a different tense. Of course, it should be take, but it just sounds so much better when you say hook, book, look, and took. So yeah, this is for me a very simple, easy framework that helps me to make a short devotion that will help. That will help to have a meaningful impact on the hearer. The hook part is simply somehow that we want to grab the attention of the hearer. That can be done in a whole lot of different ways, and that could be by making a provocative statement. It could be done by asking a question. It could be done already if, for example, we're doing an object lesson, that whatever thing that we, physical thing that we want to use to make our point. Say, for example, we've decided no, our the physical thing that we want to use to show them might be a stone or a banana or whatever the point, whatever object that we can use to make our point. Our starting point, our hook might be around this physical thing, or an action. Carrying a light in and putting it on a pedestal might be our hook. Now, by hook, we don't mean that we want to somehow catch our audience out. And there I need to give a word of warning also. Asking a question in order to ridicule our hearer seldom goes down well. Some people that I know of react very allergically to that, and no matter how clever we may think we are when we're doing that, we will probably lose our audience when we try to ridicule. When we ask a question and we have a particular answer in mind and we just want to prove that none of the audience actually comes up with the right answer, and then we will give them the model answer, that is not a good hook. A good hook would be a question that delves deeper, that might have multiple correct answers, and we might want to look at a particular answer that we want to bring, but we don't want to, in the process, ridicule the hearers about their answers. Their answers can maybe stand alongside that, alongside our answer that we might want to focus on. But yeah, the use of questions can be very helpful, but it can also have the exact opposite effect if the effect is that the hearer is being ridiculed in the process. It could be a provocative statement, as I said, so we can make a statement even in order to completely disagree with the opening statement in the very next sentence. We can do that. Trying to think of an example now. Yeah, I'll come up with something just now. But yeah, the hook can take many, many different forms. The hook can be a picture as well. If we have a picture and we ask the listeners, what do you see? That can be a hook. And particularly a multifaceted piece of art can bring up many different aspects that we can then delve into deeper as we go into the devotion. So the hook is the first part. The book is, of course, then the Bible text, the Bible verse that we want to use. So we basically say, okay, now that I've got your attention, let's go into an aspect of Scripture and bring that into the conversation. And of course, that can, again, look very, very differently. It could be a few verses that you read. It could be a single verse that you read. It could even be the retelling of a story, not in the exact words of the Bible, but recognizable as a story that comes from Scripture. Of course, we can already do that in the hook part. We could, of course, also, for example, in the hook part, tell a story that is either a modernized version of a Bible story, to bring it into our situation, to connect the hero with the story. It could also be a story that is quite different, that we want to contrast with the Bible passage as we want to bring it in. So we could tell a story that maybe says the complete opposite, and we say, okay, this is a story that so-and-so told, but what does the Bible say about that? Or even a statement that is contrary to the that is contrary to the story that we bring. For example, many years ago, as much as I'm a Johnny Clegg fan, here and there are statements in Johnny Clegg's lyrics that I, as a Christian, cannot agree with. So, for example, where Johnny Clegg sings that beautiful song, Spirit of the Great Heart, or where he says, every man has to be his own savior. It's not something that I, as a Christian, can support. And then I can get into conversation with my listeners, even if they don't physically say words, but in their mind, they can start thinking around that. Is this something that I, as a Christian, can say? Every man has to be his own savior? And I say, no, we say Jesus is our savior. What does that mean? And then we go into the book, and then into the next step, the look, looking at in more detail, what does that mean in that Bible passage, in that Bible story, in our lives as Christians? And that then takes us to the fourth part, the took part. What thought, what main insight can my listeners take home with them after my devotion is over? And that, again, it develops then from the contents of the book and the look part, something that they can take home. And it can be explicitly stated along the lines of, if there is one thought that I can leave with you today, then it is this, and then make that statement. But it can also be implied as a sort of a closing statement. Doesn't have to be as explicit as that. Does that make sense to you at this stage? Any questions, any comments, any thoughts on this simple pattern? Anything?
Telling a joke.
Telling a joke. Okay. Some people, some pastors even like to use a joke as a hook. It can be, but it needs to be very carefully chosen. Again, particularly if you don't know exactly the life story of every single person sitting there, a joke that is misunderstood, or a joke that that you didn't really think how that particular joke could be offensive, it might backfire on you. You need to be very cautious. I'm not saying don't ever use a joke. A joke can be very effective. But be very aware of who your audience is when you choose a joke. Yes. Any other thought? Comment?
Just make sure the joke is funny as well.
Yes, make sure the joke is funny as well. If the joke just backfires in the way that nobody finds it funny, then it is also pretty silly. And again, also know your audience. Some congregations, you may find that laughing is just considered irreverent in a church service. And even if you tell the funniest joke, people will just not laugh because it's not deemed respectful of the church service. Yeah, again, know your audience.
Hello. Can you...
The silence from the Zoom.
Hello.
from the Zoom participants is making me a bit nervous. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. I want to ask a question.
Hello?
Hello. Do you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I'm just asking if you can go back to the look again. I think I must have missed it.
Okay, I did go through it very quickly, I must admit. Yes. So the look would be basically almost like once you've now brought the Bible passage in the book part or the Bible verse, the look would then basically ask the question, what does this mean for us now? What is this Bible passage? What message does what message must the hearer hear from this? So the book part would be purely presenting the Bible verse or the Bible passage, and the look is then basically digging deeper into that into that Bible passage. And of course, our preparation that we did with that key we would possibly unpack some of that, but or certainly we would unpack some of the insights that we've gained, but particularly with reference to what does it mean for my hearer. Not just asking what did it mean for the original audience in that Bible passage, but what does it mean for our hearer, and how does that, how is that, in what way is that important to my hearer? And the chuk is then basically just sort of wrapping the part up. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay. I mean, yeah, we can unpack that a whole lot more, but it of course depends so much on the actual nature of the text and of my audience that we can give a whole lot of examples and still not cover all the possible examples. Thanks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd just like to bounce something off you. I wrote something recently, it's actually for Christmas. Starting off with what does Christmas mean to us, but leaving aside Christ. As the introduction, I just said, the business is good and tourism is good. The shops are already celebrating Christmas, opening up with all the things. But then the real introduction was we've got to ask the right person, what is the meaning of Christmas? And that then was the intro. It was a bit of a long intro, but I hope that'll work. Sort of summing up what the man in the street that's not a Christian feels about Christmas, but then finally, what is real Christmas? Are we putting Christ back into Christmas? So I think illustrates your point. Hopefully it is the right way.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, that would be an example of a hook. The hook often doesn't necessarily have to already bring your main point, but it does need to somehow connect your hearer to what you're about to say. You somehow need to, the hook is there to draw the hearer in, and you may very well do that by, I mean, Christian hearers, when they hear about, Christmas is good for business, Christmas turns the red numbers in the ledgers into black, and that kind of thing. Your Christian hearer would already say, okay, I hear that, but surely that's not what Christmas is about. And then you already hooked them so that you can then re-emphasize the point that you're trying to make, that Christmas is about Christ. Of course, that particular thought has been used many times before, and you need to find a way to maybe say that in a unique way, in a way that that then your listener doesn't shut off straight after you've made your point. Because of course many have lamented how commercialized Christmas has become, and so on. So choose your words carefully if you're using a thought that might have been used a dozen times before, but it's still a valid point to be made. And yes, it is a good way to hook your listener. Thank you.
Martin, I have a question. My name is Karin.
Yes.
My question is, how do I know how long must the devotion be? When is enough? When I'm overdoing it, or when is it too short, or how long must it be?
There's no easy, simple answer to that question. I think to some degree it will depend on when you've said what you want to say. Don't labor on the point. Once you've said what you want to say, then it's enough. But also sometimes the setting will determine how much time you have to say what you want to say. So say for example in a birthday setting, if you have a predominantly Christian audience, as in the visitors at the birthday party, maybe some of them would want a longer, maybe closer to your 7 or 8 minute mark devotion, whereas some others might be sitting there and saying, why is this woman talking so long? All we want to do is we want to raise our glasses to the birthday boy or the birthday girl. Then, yeah, you need to read your room very carefully there. And sometimes also be prepared to make some last minute adjustments. If you assume most of your audience to want a long devotion, and then you walk in there and you see, no, all of them are just waiting for their piece of cake, then try to shorten your thoughts. And of course, there's always the challenging part of sometimes you can say something in 5 minutes, but you can also say it slightly better in 8 minutes. But you can say it almost as well in 3 minutes as well. And there it's a question then of preparation, but also of flexibility, of maybe leaving out 1 or 2 sentences that you might have wanted to add, but that would then just extend it. It's always got to do with how clear are you on the point you want to make, and then also how well do you read the room.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes?
Having done devotions before, I find it very difficult to do it off by heart and I read the devotion, but I don't think that's a good idea. I think it would be better if you can spontaneously be so well prepared that you can. What do you think about that?
It is, yes. So the question of whether you work completely off a script that you've written down, or to what degree do you speak freely? I think, again, it depends very much on the audience that you have in front of you. If you're very nervous about your audience, you may want to hold on to something very thoroughly prepared, word for word written out. And that's okay, so long as you can still manage to make eye contact and build rapport with your listeners. I don't think there's necessarily anything that speaks against a word-for-word script. But at the same time, if you can get away with just writing down some bullet points for yourself and speaking freely and building the sentences around those bullet points freely, so much the better. But it is a matter of practice as well. And if you do it regularly, you get more and more comfortable with that.
Martin, I think the tricky part of it is when you go home, and I'm calling it home. I'm not saying rural area because it's my home,
yes.
where my
Yes.
father was born.
Yes.
Our children will go there with their colleagues who are diverse. They don't even understand anything about Sepedi.
Yes.
You are trying to accommodate them. Then again, you look at the people in the village. Those are the people that live there. You also want to accommodate them. That's why sometimes it becomes tricky because you must try and satisfy everybody. I mean, I cannot leave out our parents from home because that's my home. That's where I come from. And again, I don't want to ignore my children. I know they complain sometimes to say that they didn't hear a thing because I was trying to limit myself. And when I say I'm talking about other people as well. They try to limit themselves. But again, the language barrier becomes a problem.
Yes, absolutely. And especially the more diverse your listenership is, your audience, the more tricky it becomes. Whether it is around the question of language, or whether it is around the question of level of education, or also just life experiences. If you are speaking to people that are living in the deep rural areas who may only very occasionally see television, making any reference to to whatever the political situation or any TV show that a city dweller might be watching on a regular basis, it gets quite tricky. But I still believe that if we apply our minds, we will find topics and ways of expression that are so deeply rooted in our common humanity that I do think that if we try hard enough, we will always find something that will speak into a wide variety of different contexts. And again, the better we ourselves know all these different contexts, the better we will be able to apply that. And sometimes I think using physical objects or pictures or that kind of thing can actually cross those barriers a little bit, because pictures somehow can speak on many different levels. Stories can also speak on many different levels. There's a reason why the parables of Jesus are so powerful, is because they speak to people in so many different ways. Again, as a city dweller, we might not know anything about fishing. We might not have ever caught a fish in our lives, and yet we do not. We can still somehow connect to the image of people fishing. We've seen it on TV. We've read books about it, and so even something that might be foreign to my personal experience, we can somehow link. For example, take the story of where the disciples, before Jesus called them, didn't catch anything the whole night. We might not have that experience of us sitting for hours and hours and never having caught a fish, but the idea of putting a lot of effort into something and then being disappointed when the result doesn't come back to us as a successful endeavor. That sense of disappointment is maybe the point at which we can then connect a whole lot of different listeners, because we can connect a grade 4 student, for example, who then puts a lot of effort into practicing their vocabulary for their vocabulary test, and then they get a bad mark. You can connect that. You can connect to somebody who's in business and has put together a project proposal, and the project proposal gets rejected. You can connect it to somebody who's planted some flowers in their front garden, and at night the buck walks out of the bushes and eats all my beautiful flowers. All of that can be examples of the same sense of disappointment. And we can latch onto that common human experience of disappointment, which we will experience in different ways. Just an example.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question. It might not be direct to what we've just discussed now, but I've had a few times where we mention a reflection. And earlier on, when you described a devotion, you said it is not a sermon, it is not a Bible study. Is a reflection another way of presenting a Bible study? So not a Bible study, a verse, or is it just a word that is used in place of devotion? Please clarify.
Yeah. Okay, so the word reflection can either be, it gets used in different ways. Certainly the end product of a devotion could be in the form of a reflection on a particular verse, or a reflection on a particular picture. For example, if we say Christ is the light of the world, we can reflect on the meaning of the word light and how Christ is in fact the light of the world. We can reflect on that. Either we reflect on it in our preparation, but also the way that we present our devotion. Our devotion could be a reflection. Our devotion could be a retelling of a story, and then with picking out on now what does that mean. That's then not so much a reflection. It's more of just sort of a lesson that we pick up out of a story. Reflection can be used in many different ways in that. But yes, it certainly is one form of a devotion.
Thank you very much.
Okay, how are we doing for time? Sorry,
I think it's 2 minutes.
2 minutes left. Okay, all right. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we've come to the end. Otherwise, we don't need to labor the point if there's nobody else. Then at that stage, yeah, I hope this has been meaningful to you. Well,
one question / comment. I've found that, well, given that much of this also overlaps with sermon preparation, tools and procedures, I found that in the researching portion, one is always terribly tempted to put so much in your basket that it becomes very difficult to leave some things, or put some things in the bin and then put some things on the table. So I was wondering, perhaps a word of wisdom on how to do the preparation with the aim in mind, so that you do not prepare 8 pages of exegesis and historical research and try and then squish all of that into a 5-minute devotion or a 6-minute devotion. Perhaps some suggestions.
Yeah, I think there one can limit, one can, if you've clearly defined your personal main idea, that often will be shaped more by what hearers am I expecting to be there on the occasion when I present the devotion, that I think what is important for them to hear right now. And then I consciously choose not to research every single detail of the text that I'm using. I can then say, okay, with this aim in mind, with this goal in mind of what I want to bring across, let me research specifically things that might have bearing on that. And I mean, research is endless. Research, you can write on a single Bible verse, you can write an entire PhD thesis if you put your mind to it, if you're working in that field. But you can also just give a short, simple devotion that will just help somebody just a little step along their way on their faith. And yeah, it all depends on how much detail you put in. Okay. All right, I think that is it from my side then. And yeah, maybe if Detlef, could you say how it's going on in the afternoon then?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Martin, for your input. I think it was valuable, and everybody for participating. I will now close this session and open again. We said that we would have the second session. Oh, let me just make sure that I've got this very much right. At 2 o'clock to 15:30. So I'll open again at just before 2, but I'll close for lunch, which you have to provide for yourselves. Just after the session, I'll send out an email to everybody involved, requesting you to do a short evaluation on a Google sheet, Google form, so that we have some idea where we can improve. Please do so. And then, yeah, thank you very much, Martin, and I hope to see you again at about just before 2. Have a good
afternoon. Maybe one more thing from my side. I will also then by email be sharing with you this key that I use with all the questions, and I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint as I presented it today.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Okay.
So have a good lunch, everybody. See you later afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you, Martin.